would like to start this video by saying there is nothing in this house that will frighten you, and if you want to see a ghost, this is not the place to go. The hauntings here are far more subtle than that, and would go totally unnoticed by all who'd spend a holiday within the walls of this ancient house. With parts of the house dating back to medieval times, and the same family living there for over 600 years, it is easy to understand why it could be haunted. However, in a quick look through a couple of years of the logbooks, there is no mention of any of the guests having encountered a ghost. People have, however, talked about unexplained footsteps, which could possibly be explained by the creaking timbers as they expand and contract during daytime and nighttime. Then there is the presence in the hall, the oldest part of the house. The medieval Crook Trust Hall has been described by visitors as having a very strong, heavy atmosphere, as if it is still being watched over by its long-lasting occupants. My partner and I didn't notice any of this and just remained in awe of the building as a whole. Yes, the wooden floors creaked every time you walked on them, both upstairs and downstairs, but in a building of that age, that was to be expected. Only on one occasion did I hear the possible sound of footsteps whilst lay in bed one night, but they didn't last for long, and the sounds never repeated. Most people would put the noises down to other members of their party moving around, as the place is able to accommodate a group of 8, but there were only the two of us rattling around in this huge medieval house for 4 long nights, with not another soul close by. First night there was spent unpacking and exploring and just getting a general feel for the place. As I've already said, the place is huge and takes a bit of getting used to. We just relaxed and prepared ourselves for the coming days. The next day was spent exploring the garden with its 13th century dovecote and just relaxing. After all, we were on holiday. In the evening, I decided to set up some of our equipment. I placed motion sensors in 2 of the bedrooms. These smart sensors use radar to detect motion and can be used to turn on lights in a smart environment. I also used USB smart bulbs connected to USB smart switches so I could monitor the sensors from another room. I also used a smart speaker to announce the triggers of the detectors. I used the same timer sensors at home to automatically turn lights on when someone walks into a room. These sensors frequently trigger for no apparent reason, which would lead one to question if they aren't really that efficient, but, on the other hand, items do have a tendency to fall off worktops or tables for no apparent reason, but I guess that is another story. I have also used these sensors in other locations with no history whatsoever of hauntings, and there have been no unexplained triggers. So how did they act in the 2 bedrooms I placed them in? As the house is a jumble of 3 distinct eras, one of the sensors was placed in a 14th century room and the other in late 17th century room. We were able to monitor any activity from a room built in the last phase of the house, which dated back to the late 18th century. For a good hour, the sensor in the 14th century room triggered frequently, whilst the sensor in the 17th century bedroom went off just once. Everything was quiet. I remotely checked the status of the sensor in the 14th century room, only to discover it had gone offline. Since this sensor was running off a battery pack using 4 AA batteries, I assumed they must have drained, and so I went, to recover it. On inspecting the battery pack, I noticed that the manual on-off switch had been turned to the off position. Maybe it hadn't been switched fully over in the first place, causing accidental motion triggers. I flicked the switch over to on and left the room to go back to our monitoring station in the lounge. Once again it started to trigger motion for about 5 minutes, then it stopped again. After about 15 minutes I went to check it again. Once more the switch on the battery box was in the off position. I replaced the battery box with a mains adapter, but whatever it was that had been triggering the sensor and kept switching off the battery box had had its fun for the night, and there were no more incidents from that sensor. Next, I set up a CCTV camera at the top of the stairs, pointing down the corridor towards the other staircase at the other end of the house. During the rest of the evening, there was no unexplainable motion detected, but I decided to leave the camera running overnight just in case anything happened whilst we were asleep. After a good night's sleep, I headed down the stairs and into the kitchen at the other end of the house, where we had set up a charging station for our phones. On my way down the hallway, I noticed that the museum door was wide open. When my partner came down, I asked her if she had noticed it open the night before, but like me, she couldn't be sure. It seemed the ideal location to put the CCTV camera next. I checked my phone and noticed that the camera had triggered at 6:44 a.m. I eagerly went to review the footage, expecting to see an orb, or is it just dust, silently floating down the corridor. I couldn't have been more wrong. At 6:44 a.m., the camera is no longer in the hallway, but is instead in the lounge. It stays there for about 6 seconds before returning to the hall. It stays in the hall for a short while, then returns for another more extended session in the lounge, before returning one last time to the hall, where it's stayed ever since. It would have made sense if I had more than one of these cameras running, where there is a possibility that the feed could bleed over. This was the only camera there. If the camera had been unplugged and physically taken into the room, there would have been a time drop of a minute or so whilst the camera rebooted and reconnected to the internet. The timestamp cannot have been fiddled with, as it is set by the internet. How could it have a recording of a room it hadn't even been in? So many questions and no logical answers. As we headed outside to try and make sense of the video we had recorded, we heard a creaking sound from further up the corridor. On our return, on inspection, the museum door was once more open. To be honest, the door would only pull to and not shut properly. Maybe it was no more than a draft that was causing the issue. Setting the CCTV camera up in the museum would hopefully resolve the issue. With the camera running in the museum and the sensors set up in 2 other rooms, we eagerly awaited something to happen. The problem was, though, that nothing did. For the rest of Wednesday, everything remained quiet. It wasn't until Thursday afternoon that we noticed that the museum door was slightly open. We checked the CCTV where we had caught the door opening slightly. We now had something to investigate. Starting with the door in its partially open position, I repeatedly opened and closed the door to the garden. With some vigor, I was able to achieve the following footage, but it took a lot of effort to do so. I then decided to check the overnight wind speed for the early hours of Wednesday morning, which was relatively light, generally ranging between 4 miles per hour and 6 miles per hour, nowhere near enough to case enough draft through the corridor to open the museum door. Next, I fetched a tray from the kitchen, just to see what effort it would take to open the museum door. As far as we were concerned, that was the end, as we had to start packing away, ready to return home the next day. The weather had been particularly kind to us, considering it was only early March. On a couple of days we'd even managed to sit outside on the picnic table, with the sun shining warmly on us. As we were in the bedroom, packing what we could away, the wind started howling down the chimney. Maybe we had had the best of the weather and things were about to change. Suddenly there was a tremendous crash that emanated from the other end of the building. My partner and I exchanged glances, and I shot up and headed out of the room to see what the commotion was. I raced down the stairs and headed to the far end of the building. On reaching the kitchen, I found the kitchen door wide open. It was windy, though, so I thought nothing of it. It did seem strange, though, that the museum door was still shut. Even my rushing by had had no effect. I returned to the bedroom and continued packing, thinking nothing more of it. On our way home the following day, I thought about the incident and pondered as to why the museum door had remained closed during such a strong wind. On getting home, I once again checked the internet for the previous night's wind speed. I was shocked to read that in the late hours of Thursday, March 5th, 2026, the wind speed for our location was calm, approximately 4 miles per hour. In other words, there was no wind that night. So, what wrenched the door open in the kitchen, and what was the howling down the bedroom chimney? I guess we'll never know.